questa piccola pausa. Arriviamo adesso alla relazione del professor Bo Christian Holm, che conosco già da alcuni anni dalla Luther Accademia Ratzeburg, di cui è, come avevo già detto nell'introduzione, il vicepresidente. Lui quindi insegna a Aarhus geschrieben così, in Danimarca, teologia sistematica. Ha scritto la sua dissertazione con il tema Gabe und Geben, cioè dono e dare, e ha anche curato alcune altre pubblicazioni sempre su questo tema, che quindi è un tema così centrale da lui, e quindi cioè il tema era Gabe und Geben bei Luther oder in Luther, cioè dono e dare in Lutero, e quindi anche stasera affronterà questo tema a partire del concetto del dono, del dare, e mostrerà un po' come già dal concetto del dono si può poi arrivare anche a qualcosa che è simile a questa tesi della scuola finlandese, che l'uomo in qualche modo partecipa a quello che è Dio. E quindi do adesso la parola a lui. Avete, spero, tutti una traduzione che Roberto Tresoldi ha così fatto negli ultimi giorni, senza le note, perché le note verranno poi anche pubblicate con il libro. Ok, danke, e an dich das Wort. Ja.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation and introduction, and as I'm also the Vice President of the Luther Academy, I want to bring warm greetings from the Academy in Germany to this sister Academy in Italy. Since the very beginning of my career as Luther scholar, I have been fascinated by the so-called New Finnish Luther research. And my first academic study, a prize dissertation from '95 on the understanding of sanctification in Luther and Moltmann, written just 6 years after the German translation of Mannermann's book, Wer im Glauben gegenwärtige Christus, later on also translated into English. I was attracted by the refiguration of Luther's theology, a refiguration that rearranged the usual relation between and understanding of justification and sanctification. This was no coincidence, it was the very claim of this new school in Luther research. Mannermann's Luther interpretation focused on two interrelated subjects: the deification of the human being, also known as theosis, and the idea of Christ present in faith, the latter making it possible to argue for the legitimacy of the former within a Lutheran theology. In pair, these ideas made it possible to understand justification much more effectively as commonly accepted within traditional Luther research. Mannermann's approach was not uncontested. Primarily from German scholarship, the accusation of Auxiliarism came rapidly. There were, however, also other voices that had more in common with the New Finnish approach as others. In the work Lehrverurteilen Kirchentrennend, led by Karl Lehmann and Wolfhard Pannenberg, justification was understood as a term covering dimensions broader than the pure forensic one. Here it is stated that the love that is God's and therefore external to human being is at the same time poured out in the heart of the believer and is identical with the gifts of the Holy Spirit, and as such unites human beings with Christ and empowers human beings to live a new life. The way divine presence is depicted here corresponds in many respects to the understanding that slowly developed in the 16th century Reformation theology. We find it in Melanchthon as well as in the Formula of Concord, where divine presence is primarily connected to the Holy Spirit. The biblical background is clear, and that is the very reason for the idea's presence in Melanchthon's biblically rooted theology. Manama and his school, however, rooted the divine presence in the presence of Christ and not primarily in the Holy Spirit's presence. This emphasis was, however, not totally absent in research either. In his work Rechtfertigung, the volume 12 of the Handbuch Systematischer Theologie, Albrecht Peters emphasized the real presence of Christ in the believer. Regin Printer, the Danish Luther scholar, anticipated central ideas of Finnish Luther research when he, in a footnote in an article on God as love, noted that Luther's idea of justification in its core converged with central ideas in the patristic doctrine of the theopoiesis of human beings. The main problem, and some would say still existing problem, is how to understand the concept of deification with regard to Luther thinking. And here I have to admit, after reading Finnish Luther studies for the last 20 years, that I'm still not sure of how to understand deification in Luther, but I'm quite convinced that one has to do it. It was the great contribution of the Manama School to international Luther research. In the following, my attempt is to give you a structural argument for why it is so. I am, first and foremost, a systematic theologian, and my argument will be more systematic rather than historical. This does not mean that I neglect historical Luther research. By no means. I have done quite a lot myself. But I tend to think that Luther forms also a position that could become a relevant discussion partner also for contemporary discussions on theology, gift and giving. In presenting this, a systematic rather than a purely historical approach seems suitable. On the other hand, Luther's formulation often presupposes ideas that are not expressively mentioned in his text. So a vital part of doing Luther research is also to reconstruct the basic framework of Luther's thinking. Here I agree with the Finnish Luther research, which has made this also a essential argument. The lacuna I find in Finnish Luther research, however, has to do with the fact that Finnish Luther studies have not yet formulated their interpretation of Luther in a language rooted in contemporary understanding of reality. What they lack, and perhaps still lack, is the reformulation of Luther thought in a language that corresponds with our contemporary usage. What does it actually mean that Christ is present in faith? How should this presence be understood? How does this presence relate to, in Luther theology, to the general presence of God in the world? My own point of departure is the gift studies that social anthropology has delivered in Marcel Mauss's groundbreaking work, Essai sur le don, from 1923-24. Whereas many theologians, as well as philosophers, have tried to defend the theory of the economy-free gift, my point of departure has been Mauss's argument that every gift is enrolled in a context of gift exchange, that gift giving is a total social fact, and that it is this ever ongoing exchange that keeps societies and fellowships together, constantly renewing the social bonds. According to my point of view, the gift discourse can at least partially catch up with the need for terminological clarification, but only partially. There will still be unsolved questions left. being quite unsatisfied with a traditional emphasis on the forensic dimension of justification, the Manama school offered an interesting alternative. An alternative, however, that did not answer all questions but resulted in new ones. Of these, the major one was, how was Luther's idea of divine presence in the believer to be understood? Luther never gave any philosophically solid explanation himself. If Christ was present in the believer, he was there in pitch darkness, in tenebris, in the same darkness that covered the top of Mount Sinai and filled the holiest of holies in the temple in Jerusalem. Thick but inscrutable divine presence. The interpretation that Manama offered was here of no real help. The term real ontic presence remained a heuristic term, good for rearranging Luther interpretations, less good for establishing a new consistent and clear terminology. Does one have at least some sympathy for Melanchthon's effort in establishing clear concepts? The Finnish interpretation still has some work to do in this respect. In Manama's Luther reading, justification is understood the following way, here quoted in the English translation. Justification is not merely a new ethical or juridical relation between God and a human being. When a human being believes in Christ, Christ is present in the very fullness of his divine and human nature in that faith itself. Luther understands the presence of Christ in such a concrete way that according to his view, Christ and the Christian become one person. In this happy exchange, the human being becomes partaker of God's attributes. The attribute that Luther mentions most often are life, righteousness, wisdom, salvation, blessedness, power, joy, courage, new understanding, and love. Risto Saarinen has rightly pointed out that Manama here continues a certain line in German Luther research, which can be traced back to Karl Holl, underlining the anticipatory and transformatory nature of God's act of justification, a line that Saarinen follows all the way up to Wolfhard Pannenberg. The link back to Karl Holl is of special interest. Saarinen has in another work sketched the Kantian influence of Luther research from Neo-Protestantism up to Parte, emphasizing the philosophical background for not dealing with ontological questions in reading Luther. Following Kant, we can only speak of the effect, never of the being of something. And this goes for divine presence as well. Following this post-Kantian premise, scholars, so were the Finnish claim, was unable to understand what Luther was really saying. The Finnish approach to Luther offers to research a variety of crucial questions. I've here listed 3. The relation between forensic and effective justification, or between divine grace and divine gift. The difference between an ontology of substance and an ontology of relation. The understanding of activity and passivity. According to my Luther reading, almost the same questions arise from an interpretation of Luther inspired by the gift discourse. In Luther's first lectures on the Psalms, Dictata super Psalterium, Luther defines what is meant by being God. His definitions point at an intimate connection between relationality, theology of creation, and gift terminology. Hoc est esse Deum, non bona accipere sed dara, et bona pro mala retribuere. This is being God, not to receive goods, but to give and retaliate evil with good. The quote is content-loaded. Firstly, it shows a tight connection between Luther's concept of God and an understanding of God as giver, which anticipates the understanding of God as the threefold giver in Luther's later explanation of the Creed in the Large Catechism, and above all in Vom Abendmahl Christi Bekenntnis. Secondly, it shows Luther's antithetical thinking, human versus God, giving versus receiving, good versus evil. Thirdly, it gives a clue towards Luther's later transgression of his early form of antithetical thinking. Even though Luther describes divine being as a giving being, human being cannot, this is my claim, exhaustively be defined as receiving beings, although the very existence of human beings in a profound sense must be understood as received, created being. Nevertheless, if the human being should be understood as recipient in relation to divine giving, then human beings have, in a way, to be understood as givers too. This is my thesis. And according to my reading, Luther agrees with me. And exactly here lies the structural argument for the assertion that deification is a necessary dimension of justification. But it is an assertion, and as such it demands to be proven. I hope to be able to do so in the following. In my attempt to deliver the proof, I will use a tool introduced by one of the main developers or refiners of the Finnish Luther school. Risto Saarinen makes in his book God and the Gift a promising distinction between a giver-oriented and a receiver-oriented perspective. Saarinen's claim is that it makes a huge difference whether one argues theologically from the perspective of the giver or from the perspective of the receiver. From the perspective of the receiver, it is in a Lutheran context necessary to emphasize the passivity of the human being in order to avoid Pelagianism. Seeing the divine-human relationship from the perspective of giving, from the perspective of divine giving, things becomes many-faceted. Human beings then also have to be understood as givers, or as active in a certain sense, or at least as attentive and involved. Saarinen puts it this way. The issue is rather complex, since even when we speak of other human beings giving us something, we perform a small act of faith. Strictly speaking, we do not know the intentions of other people, the givers whose minds we cannot read. Is my neighbor giving me this thing as a gift? Or should we rather speak of mutual commitment, economic exchange, and entering into contract? A small act of faith is needed when gift is believed to be a free gift. The problematic term here is the free gift. In normal use, the term free gift has at least two different meanings. It can either mean free gift as a pure gift, as a gift without recompense, or it can mean the unconditional gift, the gift giving without cause or reason. The former I find problematic, the latter not, as we shall see, and one has to be rather conscious about specific use. My next claim is that the divine free gift in Luther's writings is not a gift without recompense, since the alternative between pure gift and exchange or contract is imprecise. The justified human being has to be understood not only as receiver but also as giver. And I'll try to argue for that. Whereas the young Luther can emphasize that human beings cannot give to God anything in recompense for his or her life, not even for a single hour, Luther, some years later in 22, can very bluntly use direct mercantile or economic language in his explanation of divine justice. in his preface to Romans from 22. Now justice is such a faith. It is called God's justice, or the justice which is valid in God's sight, because it is God who gives it and reckons it as justice for the sake of Christ our mediator. It influences a person to give to everyone what he owes him. Through faith, a person becomes sinless and eager for God's commands. Thus he gives God the honor due him and pays him what he owes him. He serves people willingly with the means available to him. In this way he pays everyone his due. Neither nature nor free will, nor our own powers can bring about such a justice. For even as no one can give himself faith, so too he cannot remove unbelief. How can he then take away even the smallest sin? Therefore, everything which takes place outside faith or in unbelief is lie, hypocrisy, and sin, no matter how smoothly it may seem to go. The human is here not just receiver, but in relation to both God and other humans also giver. The crucial question here is whether this being a giver is belonging to the sphere of justification or the sphere of sanctification. Emphasizing sanctification here would remove the problem. Human beings can then be understood as receivers in justification and givers in sanctification. But there is, according to my point of view, both theological and structural reasons for claiming this to be the too easy solution. Reception involves an element of giving, namely in form of the recognition of the giver, which is encompassed in the positive reception. Recognition of the giver plays, without any surprise, a central role in Luther's understanding of the divine-human relationship. The recognition of creation as God's good gift and of human beings as permanent recipients is to a large extent coinciding with letting God be God, and has its parallel in the human confession that one does not have existence in oneself, but is in the most fundamental sense recipient of existence. From Mose, we have not only learned that gifts belongs to the context of gift exchange, we have also learned that in social relations the position of the giver is the high position, the position of the receiver the lower one. To show one's generosity is also to show one's power. Not to give is to show one's lowly status. But while the receiver position in social relations by default is lower than the giver position, the receiver position in relation to God is, although lower, not any disrating of the human being, as long as human being lives according to the word of God that makes creation into divine gift and an expression of divine grace. Luther's theology develops, and his development can be seen as an expanding of the first definition of God as giving in the first lectures on the Psalms. In Luther's latest lecture, the Lectures of Genesis, we find some remarkable expressions of the divine-human exchange of gifts. Adam had in paradise a small grove where the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil grew. This small grove is for Luther the first church in the world, and put there before the creation of Adam in order to give Adam a place for serving, worshipping, and nonetheless giving thanks for God's blessed gifts. Luther's understanding of Adam in paradise emphasizes that the relation between God and human also implies a fundamental social dimension carried by the conception of mutual giving and receiving in social life. A similar social reading of Luther can be found in Gerhard Eberling's Luther Studies. According to Eberling, Luther's theology represents a shift from a thinking bound to nouns to a thinking bound to prepositions. For Ebeling, the coram relation is constitutive. Humans find always themselves in front of something or someone, God, other human beings, the world, oneself. On this background, Ebeling defines being as being together, sein als Zusammensein. As the human always stand in front of another, it is always determined by the one standing opposite. The coram relation is therefore for Ebeling also a forum situation, or a situation of judgment. The human is always delivered to an external judgment. The coram relation is therefore more than anything else a forensic situation. In this way, Ebeling's understanding of Luther was bound to a fundamental perception of reality. The question is, however, if this forensic understanding of the fundamental relationality in Luther's theology can escape the accusation of being reductionist. That it cannot was the argument of Manama and his school. For Manama, Ebeling neglected the ontological dimension despite the talking of relational ontology in the Ebeling school. As you may have noticed, I have not so far been dealing with the ontological question in more than a pair of subordinate clauses. Instead, my point of departure has been the social dimension of Luther's doctrine of justification. I will still continue along this line for a while, trying to offer another map of orientation in the valley between Manama and Ebeling. If divine giving is consequently defined as giving, the understanding of human being as receiving cannot be consequently accomplished. A gift is not truly given unless it is received as such. But by this premise, the gift is understood as the good gift. And from my point of view, and that's quite important, a lot of theological as well as philosophical works on gift and giving have neglected the difference between gifts and good gifts. Whereas social anthropology shows us how gifts are ambiguous objects, divine giving is in an absolute sense in Luther good giving. But if divine giving has to be understood as a divine good gift, then the necessary qualification of this gift as good gift seems to be the focal point. At least since Seneca, philosophers and others with a sense for the social game knew that the first return of a gift or a benefit is to receive it with gratitude. This reference to Seneca is by no means accidental. Seneca's understanding of the world as manifestations of divine benevolence can be found in both Luther's understanding of the physical world, can also be found in Luther's understanding of the physical world as a gift from God. The clearest example is the first article of faith in the Small Catechism. But Seneca's notion that gifts are just signs for the real benefit, which is the benevolence of the giver, who in this respect gives himself, or at least his attendance in the gift giving, can also be retrieved in Luther's works, not at least in his understanding of the difference between grace and gift, favor Dei and donum Dei. Registrazione has pointed at this relation between Seneca and Luther and sees in here an argument for a necessary prioritization of grace over gift, favor over donum. His purpose is to distance himself from one branch of the Finnish Luther research, identifying the two without leaving the other side. For Saarinen, it is important that forensic and effective affirmation of justification are both necessary in speaking about justification, but not in such a way that grace and gift presuppose each other. A closer look at both Luther's text and the actual issue, the gift-giving relationships, seems to make yet another possibility possible. One major premise is that an absolute dichotomy between giving and receiving cannot be upheld. The reasons are twofold. Pure receiving without the return of gratitude is a very precise characterization of the sinful state of the human being. There are situations where the best gift to give is to receive the gift of the other. Everyone who had experiences with small children making quite peculiar gift objects in kindergarten or school knows this. To receive is to include the other in the social relation. Therefore, it can be just as risky to receive a gift as it is to give one. In both cases, good faith is necessary. There are, therefore, some very good reasons why Luther cannot uphold an absolute dichotomy between giving and receiving, although the very outset has to be even this absolute dichotomy. On the one hand, Luther emphasizes a mutual relationality. On the other hand, he emphasizes that in an absolute sense only God can give. Only God can be the first unconditioned giver, as only God creates ex nihilo. There is in creation a necessary unilateral relationality which creates the relata, the creation. On the other hand, creation for Luther is always a social reality. The church, as the place for return with thanks, is created before Adam entered the world as subject for this praise. In this way, Luther's definition of divine being in dictata can only be a partial definition in the sense that divine being cannot reach its goal unless the receiver participates in this divine giving and unless the divine giving contains an element of receiving. Anyone here who in this structure can see a glimpse of Luther's Christologically informed thinking might be right, especially here. The same is the case for those who see that the social dimension of justification seems to open for an ontological dimension, a participation in the most divine property that is giving. This aspect was partly neglected in Eberling's Luther interpretation. His awareness was much more directed towards the believer's own ontological situation coram Deo. Neither did Wilfred Joes sufficiently include this dimension in his reconstruction of Luther's personal ontology. For this very reason, the Manama school made a very necessary contribution to Luther research. It might be for other reasons, but their critique of Eberling's school was nevertheless not without substance, so to speak. Despite Eberling's emphasis on the hermeneutical dimension of Luther's doctrine of justification, one should not neglect the fact that we even by Eberling find formulations highlighting the necessary element of participation in Luther's view on justification. Just to recapitulate some central points in Luther's theological development. The young Luther stresses the unilaterality of divine giving, whereas the mature Luther is able to integrate reciprocal images and language into his understanding of righteousness and justification, most clearly under his understanding of the happy exchange and his use of the marriage metaphor. If we turn to the late Luther's lectures on Galatians, we discover this very tension between divine unilaterality and human passivity on the one hand, and divine mutuality and human participating activity on the other hand, in the apparent tension between the introduction to the lectures and the interpretation of Galatians 3:6, a locus classicus in this work. Similar to his opinion in Luther's early works, Luther argues in the introduction that human being cannot pay God his due, whereas the commentary on Galatians 3:6 is in line with the mature Luther, who says that it is possible for faith to pay God his due. Luther says here in Galatians 3:6 that faith Faith is creator of divinity. Fides est creatrix divinitatis. Accompanied by the necessary clarification, non ib substantia or persona sua sed in nobis. That is, not in his substance or person, but in us. In creating divinity in human being, faith gives God his honor. But Luther here perceives is a general truth that is also in a lesser scale true for the grateful reception of gifts. The grateful reception creates the giver in some sense. And parallel to Luther's formulation, what could also here say, not in persona donoris, sed in nobis. Every giver, but of good gifts only, wishes that his or her gifts are being received with the gratitude that is the mark of every true gift. For bad or evil gifts, something else apply. For instance, the wish to control the recipient through his or her gratitude. Luther's understanding of the creative faith corresponds with the necessary expansion of the unilateral model. God gives and the human receives, but God gives by giving a new model of mutuality. In a way, Luther here anticipates and solves the problem that later is known as the master-slave problem by Hegel. In comparison with Hegel, Hegel's interest lies in the impossibility of the relation between master and slave. Luther in the relation's realization between the Lord and the Christian. In Luther's interpretation of Galatians 3:6, do we not only find the idea that God is honored in faith, but almost all main ideas in Luther's understanding of justification. According to Luther, Paul makes here faith into the greatest honoring of God. Through faith, the believer gives God the largest sacrifice. And because God, through this, is giving honor, the believer is in this way also almighty and participate in the divine properties, or even in his very being, if giving in its most strict sense belongs to divine being. In this way, also Ebeling was able to speak of human participation in the divine being. Furthermore, the giving honor to God is here qualified as acknowledging God as he who gives all good things. After this, the famous formulation follows that faith, by this acknowledging, fulfills divinity. To fulfill divinity, faith has to give God what God already has and is in himself, but not is or have in human beings, and therefore, in a sense, is not yet completed in his divinity. The divinity of God is then not fulfilled without the relation to human beings. This seems to be a necessary interpretation of Luther's formulation here. And the only way human beings can be giving anything back to God is by being united with that very same God. A general line in Luther's understanding of divine human gift-giving is then a simultaneity of divine and human agency. And here lies a central premise for the similarity for gift-giving approach to Luther and deification approach to Luther. Once more, a recapitulation. Only God can give, humans only receive. Despite this, the righteousness of faith consists in the human giving of something to God, even when this something is reduced to a poor gesture. And this is possible only because God gives himself to human beings. Reading Luther as a theologian of the gift is then also to read Luther as a theologian of love, insofar as love is a matter of giving oneself to the other. At the end, using the gift as way into Luther's theology, one arrives at ontological questions. The human being cannot play the role in the divine-human relationship without participating in what God is. Deification is therefore without being the main idea of Luther's doctrine of justification, its inevitable consequence. A consequence of a consequent Chalcedonian incarnation Christology, and a consequence of an understanding of God as love. By this, we can end by another Danish Luther scholar, Regin Prenter, who I mentioned in the very beginning. He begins at a certain point in his work to understand the inner Trinitarian relations using human relations as prism. The inner Trinitarian movements have to be solved as mutual self-giving and receiving. And later on, he develops this idea in the article Der Gott der Liebe ist. Here, the Christological dogma, he says, can only be understood meaningfully if God can be thought in a way that makes an incorporation of human being into God's own being possible. This can only happen if love becomes the focal point. On this background, Prenter can make the claim that there exist striking similarities between Luther's doctrine of justification and the Orthodox doctrine of theosis. From my point of view, Finnish Luther research and the rediscovery of the role of theosis in Luther's theology has moved Luther research a huge step forward. There is, however, still work to be done, not at least in putting the results of the Finnish Luther research into contemporary discussion. Such a work could find inspiration in Martin Wente's work, who in his book Die Gabe und das Gestell argues for the coincidence of a theology of the gift and a theology of the word in Luther, and he shows how Luther can be put into discussion with contemporary philosophy on his own terms. Both he and the Manama school could then perhaps also learn a little more from the ongoing discussion of the gift in social anthropology. In the end, Luther is aiming at putting the human being into the right relationship with God, and relationships are social by nature and can neither be reduced to ontic changes of forensic declarations. Thank you very much.
Oh, grazie. Un approccio da un concetto esterno ma anche interno, cioè quello del dono, che strutturalmente non è solo unilaterale, ma anche il ricevente ha un ruolo in qualche modo attivo, in questo partecipa, in questo donare. E quindi l'approccio al Lutero a partire da questo concetto con la conclusione che in qualche modo l'uomo nel ricevere la giustificazione, ricevere l'amore di Dio, in qualche modo partecipa a questo che Dio è. Abbiamo sentito la relazione e adesso c'è il tempo per le domande o le aggiunte o le commenti, le critiche. Posso fare io una domanda? Ich stelle eine Frage, und zwar, wenn Gott durch die Annahme des Geschenkes sozusagen erst er selbst wird im Gläubigen und damit irgendwie verkomplementiert wird, vervollständigt wird, was bedeutet es dann, wenn das Geschenk nicht angenommen wird? Was bedeutet das für Gott, also für den Sünder, für den Menschen bedeutet das, dass es der Ausdruck seiner Sündhaftigkeit ist. Aber was bedeutet es für Gott, wenn ein Geschenk nicht angenommen wird? Adesso ich übersetze erstmal. Quindi la mia domanda era cosa succede se il dono non viene accettato dall'uomo? visto che l'uomo partecipa e in qualche modo completa l'essere di Dio non come tale ma in se stesso, e quindi non accogliere questo dono per l'uomo significa che è il peccatore, no? È l'espressione del peccatore, ma cosa significa questo per Dio?
English or Deutsch?
English.
Okay.
English.
This is of course a question that goes above Luther's own text in a way. So one have to give a more speculative answer to the question. But so you say the very status, the condition of the human being is that human being doesn't acknowledge what is given, and actually that's the sinful nature to avoid the position of being grateful giver, and for that God had to give himself, or has given himself. So what does it mean for God? Yeah, it means that it means the cross.
Quindi traduco un momento, quindi dice che questo è certamente una domanda che va oltre il testo di Lutero, quindi una risposta speculativa, che comunque è proprio nella natura dell'uomo di essere peccatore, quindi di ignorare questo dono, e proprio perché l'uomo è così, questa è la ragione perché Dio si dona. E quindi quando questo non viene accettato, allora cosa significa per Dio? Significa la croce. Questa è la risposta. Grazie. Professor Weinio.
Addressing putting the idea of Luther's doctrine of theosis in a contemporary setting. There is a certain problem in that, because what the Finns have been doing, or what they have thought, or what we have thought, what we are doing, is that we are not doing what the Germans call the Vergegenwärtigung. So we are not trying to make Luther a contemporary thinker. So we are just trying to give a kind of loyal reading of Luther in his own context. So basically, it's just there's a sort of a joke about Finnish Luther interpretation. We are saying that we are not really interpreting Luther. We are just saying what he says. So, which is of course an exaggeration, but it sort of underlines the prospectus of the Finnish Luther school. We are just doing historical exegesis. We are not trying to make Luther kosher in the terms of contemporary theology. That's sort of a different kind of thing, but there are actually very few of us who had even tried to do something like that. Risto Saarinen is maybe the only one, and then he has done very little in this thing. But this is just as a comment. But you can comment on that if you wish.
Sì, traduco. Quindi diciamo il professor Holm aveva detto che manca ancora nella scuola finlandese di inserire questi risultati in un contesto contemporaneo, con un linguaggio contemporaneo, e il professor Vainio ha detto che non è questo lo scopo della scuola finlandese, ma la scuola finlandese cerca di leggere Lutero nel suo contesto storico e cerca di fare un'esegesi di quello che Lutero diceva. Quindi non è questa la meta, ma la meta è di leggere Lutero, non di farne un pensatore contemporaneo.
I'm aware of that, but I think that there are two levels here, there are two steps. I'm very aware of that. I think there are two steps, two questions of making Luther understandable in a contemporary settings. The one is the one you say to see how can we put Luther into contemporary discussion. That's one. That's nothing, and that's not something to do with the historical Luther research. But the part of doing historical Luther research, I would say, that is giving a contemporary readers so many tools as possible to understand, also with our contemporary knowledge, what is Luther actually talking about. And then I think there's also the possibility that when we realize that he may be applicable or may be used in contemporary discussion. But I think that there are two layers here, and I think they're actually both necessary. But you have to in two steps. And I still think that also in clarifying the concepts that there still is work to be done, not only by the Finnish schools, but in general also.
Quindi la risposta era che ci sono due passi necessari, uno di leggere Lutero nel suo contesto, ma anche di spiegare al contemporaneo con parole di oggi Lutero per far capire all'uomo d'oggi di cosa Lutero ha parlato veramente, perché se non lo possiamo capire cosa ha detto Lutero, se non lo possiamo capire con le nostre parole così contemporanee. Cioè, sì, professor Buzzi.
Grazie professor Holm, la sua relazione è molto interessante e provocante, dà da pensare, sie gibt zu denken, dà da pensare questa relazione. La mia domanda è questa: secondo lei esiste quindi soltanto una forma di pensiero, quella di tipo relazionale, sociale, strutturata sul concetto di dono reciproco e di reciprocità, che consente di pensare sia alle relazioni umane, intraumane, sia alla relazione umano-divina? E allora che cosa significa quell'espressione nell'Antico Testamento: i miei pensieri non sono i vostri pensieri, le mie vie non sono le vostre vie? In che misura nel suo concetto e nel suo schema si salvaguarda, è salvaguardata, è conservata la differenza fondamentale tra il pensiero divino e il pensiero umano, tra l'essere di Dio e l'essere dell'uomo, che è ciò che era tipico della teologia dialettica. Certo, il suo è un superamento della teologia dialettica, ma non conserva più nulla della teologia dialettica.
Franco, avevi detto se esiste una lingua per queste due relazioni o se esiste solo una lingua, o se quindi esiste una sola lingua? Und für die anderen. Okay, penso che ho capito. Also, fragt, ob es eine Sprache, eine Relation relational-soziale Sprache gibt, eine Sprache gibt, die sowohl diese Beziehung zu Gott, zwischen Mensch und Gott ausdrückt, als auch die Beziehung zwischen Mensch und Mensch. Ja, oder ob es eben eine einzige Denkform oder Sprache gibt, die beides ausdrückt, sowohl das Verhältnis Mensch-Gott als auch Mensch-Mensch. Und was es dann bedeutet, wenn Gott sagt, meine Wege sind nicht eure Wege, was bedeutet das für die dialektische Theologie, die diesen Unterschied herausgestellt hat?
I hope I have understand your question correctly. First, I think that from the outset we need to operate with the idea or the concept that there is only one language that we speak. So that if Luther is talking about a divine thing, he's actually using the same language as in earthly matters. That doesn't say that he cannot say different things, but the language is the same, the way language functions, and according to my understanding, the gift-giving relation is very close to being a matter of grammar, of fundamental grammar, of our fundamental way of understanding the world. And this way of understanding the world cannot be let out of sight in the God-human relationship. But that does not mean that there cannot be said different things. And the whole point is also in using the gift language is that God gives in another way that human being gives, because God gives. When he gives, he doesn't lose anything. Or when he loses, as on the cross, then he is not emptied totally. That is the difference between divine giving and human giving. Human giving when human gives, we always give something away and hope for a return. And so I think the use of the same language can actually say or the guard the necessary distinction between divine and human affairs.
Quindi la risposta era che abbiamo una sola lingua con cui necessariamente dobbiamo esprimere tutto, però con la stessa lingua si può anche dire cose diverse. Il concetto del dono è una cosa che usiamo diciamo per descrivere diciamo le nostre relazioni, e il dare da parte di Dio non può essere un concetto completamente fuori da questo, proprio perché abbiamo solo questa lingua. Però possiamo anche diciamo descrivere delle differenze, quindi Dio dà in un modo diverso dell'uomo, perché l'uomo dà per ricevere qualcosa indietro, mentre Dio dà senza questo. Dio non perde niente nel suo donare, e quindi ci sono queste differenze, però abbiamo una lingua in cui diciamo non possiamo pensare al di fuori di questa lingua.
Non ci sono altre domande, quindi possiamo considerare conclusa la serata, però prima I would like to give you our gift for you.
Quindi posso ricordare che i membri, i soci dell'ASLI adesso si incontrano ancora per l'assemblea annuale. Anche gli ospiti sono ben invitati di partecipare se vogliono. Chi non è ancora iscritto, qui ci sono anche i moduli di iscrizione se qualcuno vuole, e quindi a te di chiudere per oggi.
Quindi a questo punto sì. Ah sì. No, stavo rinnovando l'appuntamento per gli incontri di domani. Cominciamo alle ore 10 con la relazione del professor Fulvio Ferrario, a seguire il professor Michele Cassese verso le 11:30, poi riprenderemo al pomeriggio alle 15:30 con la relazione del professor Vainio e a chiudere alle 17 il professore Dieter Kampen darà una sua prolusione sull'intero lavoro. Vi ringrazio, siete stati pazienti, gli argomenti sono molto importanti e vanno anche un po' meditati, quindi ci ritroviamo domani con ulteriore spirito. Grazie a voi.